I'll get to the French Revolution, first French Revolution, in a minute, but
we're doing rather well, I think.
We're
covering thousands of years.
We've managed to get through several centuries in about 5 minutes here, which is pretty good going.
Yeah, more than most.
I'm actually something of a fan of Fukuyama, and I've met him a number of times, and I think, and I accept your critique of his American centrism. Mm-hmm. I've just created a new term, but I think you understand what I mean. And this is something of a deviation, but it strikes me that the end of history is possibly the most misrepresented thesis in kind of modern politics, because Fukuyama's real argument was to say that there were no longer any contestants on the field of intellectual legitimacy or moral legitimacy, other than liberal democracy, so that there would still be authoritarian governments, but that the collapse of communism meant that there was no longer any vaguely credible moral alternative that had legitimacy as an alternative to liberal democratic rule. And of course, that is actually, it may sound like hair-splitting, but that is actually quite different from the perception that has been advanced about Fukuyama, so that it's a much subtler thing that says, yeah, we'll still have dictatorships, but what we are witnessing is the death of the last form of dictatorship that had any claim to an underlying moral legitimacy that could be juxtaposed against the competing moral legitimacy of democratic rule. How do you respond to that?
You're right about that nuance, and he's often misunderstood. But I think that I have two objections to Fukuyama's view about especially the post-45 period. One is that I think after 1945, beginning above all with India, the language of institutions of democracy begin to travel and begin to take root. There is a kind of indigenization of the language and institutions of democracy, and the first great breakthrough is India. And I think, to put it simply, the character, the dynamics of Indian democracy are not describable in terms of, nor the leading ideals of Indian democracy are describable as liberal democracy. I think it's something different. And in the book, I bang the drum about Fukuyama and others actually misdescribing post-1945 real-world democracy, because of course there are the so-called liberal democracies of the American kind, but Indian democracy or democracy in Taiwan or democracy in South Africa is not driven by these or guided by these ideals. So that's one objection. The other is that it seems to me the phrase liberal democracy is a bit of a zombie phrase. I mean, it makes us feel good, or some of us feel good. But I think that actually it has a certain soporific quality, and it has the effect of actually blinding us, numbing us, silencing our thoughts about new challenges to democracy that are actually developing and gathering pace in our own times. I think you can identify a number of new trends, new challenges to the visionary leading ideals of liberal democracy. Fukuyama, it's true, says, in Russia there might be a rebirth of great Russian chauvinism. There are a few hints of that kind. And he says that the world of Islam, might not go along with liberal democracy. But I think, descriptively, this is the second objection, we are living in times where there are actually now intellectual, spiritual, if you like, never mind institutional challenges to the Fukuyama conception of democracy. What are they? What is going on in Italy, Berlusconismo, is something new. And it's something worrying. And I don't think it's liberal, and I don't think it's democratic. If you're Slavoj Žižek, you talk about it as a species of authoritarian capitalism. I think it's more than that. It's something new. It's a kind of degraded form of parliamentary democracy, where you have to own all the media, but it involves the destruction of constitutional government, the destruction of multi-party system, the weakening of parliament. Berlusconi says often, why do we need a parliament in Italy? And turning politics into a kind of low-grade showbiz.
It's a kind of soft authoritarian.
Yes, so this is a challenger. We have in China, let's say, a kind of Hu Jintaoism. Actually, better call it the harmonious society. And that's a code word for a whole cluster of ideals. Let's stick on the Fukuyama point. A whole cluster of ideals that actually represent a challenge to liberal democracy as he understands it. And it is just possible that that will succeed. And thirdly, I spot if you look at recent Iranian events, you can certainly see an authoritarian alternative to democracy that cynically uses the Quran and the Hadith, spiritual ideals, to legitimate terror and violence and, bashing people up. These are at least, I think, three options that have developed. And you could say, well, Frank, he wrote this in 1989, but he still to this day says, I cannot see any plausible, viable ideals that could rival democracy. I think this is not true, and I think we better watch out for these trends.
Well, China, of course, is run by engineers, so as Anglo-society...
Party engineers.
Well, in fact, I think 8 out of 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Politburo are engineers.
No.
And at one stage a few years ago, it was 9 out of 9.
They like harmony.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. Still, some of you would argue that's better than lawyers, of which I used to be one many, many years ago, who tend to figure prominently in our system of government.
Used to be farmers when I was in Australia.
That's right, yes. In the good old days, it was farmers. The French Revolution, 1789 to 93. Now, I semi-flippantly in the past have described this as perhaps the single most important political event in modern human history. Now, that's a slight degree of exaggeration, but nonetheless, I do, as having been a student of it, do regard it as hugely important because of the intense eruption of commitment to the principle of human equality and participation in government and tearing down of artificial and tradition-based hierarchies, which seems to me to be central to the idea of democracy. How significant was that event?
Well, highly significant, but once again, the French Revolution is about the invention of representative democracy and territorial state form. So the caveat is that lots of things happened before the French Revolution. Not only the gifts, if you like, of medieval Christianity to the birth of various crucial institutions that became vital in the French Republic, but also some pretty dramatic events. Depends whether you're, have Francophile tendencies or not, but, the thunk of a king's head on an execution platform in full view of an awe-struck public, Charles I, is a very major development in the history of representative democracy, and it, of course, fills monarchs with fear elsewhere in Europe. And if you're Dutch, you point out that actually the Dutch very early did many things that were later played out in the French Revolution. And if you're American, you say, well, actually, 1776 was, the beginning of the end of monarchic despotism and so on. I think one has to have a sense of it. But we come to the drama, the excitement, the poetry, the fear, the loathing, the joy, the excitement that the French Revolution generated. The historical record is very clear about this. What did it contribute? It's, for me, in the life and death of democracy, an example, the second example of democracy turning violent and militaristic. Yes, it's true that the constitution that is written, the principal debates, the talk of égalité, fraternité, liberté and so on, hugely important. And it's true, it's like an earthquake throughout Europe, and wider than that. But it's also a revolution that very quickly turns sour, in which terror is central, and in which there begins to be a militarization of the revolution that has European-wide effects. And this darker side of the French Revolution, I think, ought to be taken into account. It's not just exceptional, it's not just somehow nothing to do with representative democracy. If you think that the terror has nothing to do with representative democracy, you should have a look at the 5 minutes or so speech that Robespierre gave to the Convention in, I think, January 1793, where he gives a talk that says what we're doing in France is different than what the Greek world knew. Our form of democracy is representative. We elect representatives. Our form of democracy is happening in a large territorial state framework, and our form of democracy requires the extension of democracy into the social domain. So it's not just to do with government. It will transform the habits, the minds, the hearts of all French citizens. And he says in this 5-minute speech that it therefore requires terror. And when you read that, you think, God. It was this darker side of the French Revolution, sorry to disabuse you of sweet thoughts about the French Revolution, it's this dark side of the revolution, the terror, the militarization, the birth of Napoleonic politics that scares many people in Europe. And in the book, I try to sketch out a kind of rough rule that the peoples who experienced direct occupation by French revolutionary troops tended to be turned off representative democracy. The key case is the Russians. They fight the Napoleonic armies, and if you want to trace a key reason why representative democracy never really functioned well in Russia, and why the democratic tradition is so weak until today, it's because they experience democracy in military uniform. The opposite case, it's a great irony, is the British case. Tremendous fear about the French Revolution, and a great uproar, and sailors go on strike, and Tom Paine's Rights of Man becomes a sort of the best-selling pamphlet book, as he said immodestly, since the Bible. And there's fear that actually there will be a revolution in France. It didn't happen for reasons that we know well. And yet it's interesting that the ruling class, the political ruling class in Britain, learns from that experience across the water that unless they reform, unless they begin admitting, legitimizing the people, then there will be a revolution. And so begins a 19th century of British parliamentary Westminster reforms. Great irony. No French occupation, no direct invasion, but a learning that actually to avoid this upheaval, this earthquake, one has to begin, in effect, democratizing an ancient monarchy and without a written constitution.
My final question is also about the 19th century, but a very different part of the world, and something that I think was perhaps the most delightful aspect of the book, and that is Latin America. It really came home to me how little we in cultures like ours tend to know about the history of places like Latin America, because there's a very substantial section of John's book that deals with the emergence of democracy in particularly 19th century Latin America, in tandem with, of course, the achievement of independence for the multiplicity of states that started as colonies of mostly Spain, but of course also Portugal. And the fascinating thing is that in some cases, and there's one particular man who I just want to ask you about in concluding my questions, these people were ahead of their time globally, and so some of the innovations occurring in the 1820s and 1830s in Latin America appear to be well ahead of anywhere else in the world. And there's one particular man I'm interested in, and you'll have to give the correct pronunciation because it's Jose Bache, is it?
Yep.
Well, there you go, I got it right. Bache, oh, that's close. Who was a leader of Uruguay for on and off a couple of decades, I think, close to.
Several presidencies, yeah.
And was a great reformer and a relentless seeker of democratic solutions to the problems of governing a country.
I mean, this again, the standard narratives, the standard treatments of the history of democracy in English usually say nothing about Spanish America. And that's a great shame for all kinds of reasons because, as you rightly say, Lindsay, things happen very early as a consequence of the revolutions against empire. Things happen very early in the new Spanish-American republics. It's very striking that no area in Spanish America opted for monarchy. So they became republics. And this happened from 1810, 1811 onwards, first thing. Second, they all wrote constitutions. And they were remarkably advanced, much more advanced than most places on the face of the earth, in some cases more advanced than that in the United States. Third, there was a struggle for the franchise. Women got the right to vote about 70 years earlier in what is today Colombia than they did in the United States or in Britain. And what's therefore interesting is that these early constitutional republics become caught up in the American process of democratization. So the question of who is entitled to vote, indigenous peoples, male workers, women, all that goes on during the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, and it's a very complicated pattern. But so one thing that can be learned is that a lot of things happen very early. Second thing, I think that's to be learned from, and I try to do it in a very literary way, looking at characters and events and context, is that representative democracy suffered of the kind that survived until the 20s and 30s. I think we're no longer living in representative democracy in territorial state form. Our forms of democracy are different. There's a different trend. But representative democracy of the kind that almost came of age in the 19s and early 1920s and then more or less was smashed before World War II, contained within it something like an autoimmune disease, an illness. And the illness, the degradation that it made possible was that it could give rise to leaders who, in the name of the people, would become modern demagogues. And the example that I give in the book is General Rosas. You've probably never heard of him. If you read nothing in the Spanish America section, have a look at that, because at the end of the 1820s in Argentina, through to the 1850s, General Rosas tries to build the state of Argentina and to use all of the mechanisms of representative democracy, periodic elections, constitution, and so on, in order to empower himself and to produce, in effect, a one-party state, rather like the Jacobin model, where he, General Rosas, governs as he would govern a latifundia, a large cattle ranch, and treat people effectively as cattle. And if you think that's all very antiquarian, I think it later came to bedevil representative democracy, so that in the 1920s and 30s, so here Spanish America is a laboratory, in the 1920s and 30s, all kinds of dictators and demagogues arose doing things in the name of the people. And in the extreme case, Hitler had a point when he lectured Kathler Grüning in 1933, saying, Chancellor, democracy is a system of government where the people elect a majority and they form a government and they then govern. I mean, contained within the whole principles and practice of representative democracy was this possible degradation, and that happened very early also in Spanish America. Third, there's Bachi and others who, towards the end of the 19th century and during World War I and into the 20s, do really remarkable things by trying to put a stop to this. And what they do is they try to build new institutions to prevent demagogues. And Bachi in Uruguay is, I think, the leading laboratory for this, introduce all kinds of reforms like an election commission that prevents corruption of elections, that tries to weaken presidential power. Presidential forms of government, by the way, are often very bad for democracy because of this demagogic top-down possibility. And Bachi, tries to parliamentarize government, so on. So that's a little bit about Spanish America.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'll now throw it open to the floor for questions. We have roving mics.